So I always like to start with a picture of where I grew up. This is Sana'a city. Sana'a is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. As you can see, it's very beautiful. It's almost 5,000 years old. So Yemen has a rich history. And I want people to realize that, because what we hear in the media is a lot about the destruction. And I would always want to remember Yemen, the beautiful Yemen. Also, this is a map of Yemen, and the reason I wanted you to see the map of Yemen. So this is Yemen. We have Oman and we have Saudi Arabia here. But what is important to the world in terms of geopolitics is this area here. This is Bab el-Mandab, or is the Mandab Strait. That it is a choking point that is controlled by Yemen and Djibouti. So a lot of the oil that comes from Saudi Arabia, and about 15 to 30% of world trade goes through this Bab el-Mandab. So Yemen, in terms of the geography, is very important to many countries in the world. And sometimes that is actually a curse. I'll start by talking about the air raids and blockade on Yemen, and then I'll move on to the effects of that on the population. This graph is done by the Yemen Data Project, which is based in England, and it shows the air raids from March 2015 to December 2021. And you can see when the war started, there was a huge number of airstrikes or air raids on Yemen, up to 1,000 in August of 2015. And then they started going down. And the red line is the civilian targets that were affected by these air raids. But unfortunately, starting at the end of last year, we're starting to see a peak again in the violence and the air raids on Yemen. In this slide, I want to explain what an air raid is versus an airstrike. So an air raid may have multiple airstrikes. So this line here, which is very faint, this is the number of airstrikes, and these are the number of air raids. So an air raid may be in the air for 1 hour and may, target from 1 to 10 sites. So airstrikes are much larger or higher in numbers than the air raids. So why is there an increase in violence in Yemen and airstrikes in Yemen? There was a commission by the UN that was responsible for monitoring war crimes in Yemen, and it's on all sides. And I would have to say at this point in time, everybody who is at war in Yemen and engaged in the war has committed war crimes. And they were, and the UN was monitoring that. Unfortunately, in October of last year, the Saudi used incentive and threats to shut down the UN investigation of war crimes in Yemen. And that unfortunately has made it, increase the level of violence, because now we don't have a body that's monitoring war crimes that are occurring in Yemen. The other thing is also we have under the Biden administration, who had pledged that he's going to cut aid or cut support to the Saudi war in Yemen. Again, November of this year, he approved the first major arms deal under the Biden administration with air-to-air missiles. And although he said air-to-air missiles are only going to be used for defensive purposes, we know that they are used for imposing the blockade on Yemen. This is again from that Yemen Data Project, showing for 2021 how the air raids were, getting lower over time, but then we started to see a sharp increase in the air raids. This is a recent one in January of this year, where the Saudi, in 2 days in a row, targeted 2 places, one in which children were killed, at least 3 children. And then another one was a detention center, a temporary detention center in Sada, in which the final count of people who died was more than 90, and more than 260 people were injured who were in the detention center. This is from Save the Children. It says January, deadliest month since 2018, with 1 civilian killed or injured every hour in Yemen. So I'd like to talk about the US involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen. First of all, Saudi Arabia buys the most weapons from the US government, and it's the top one. It says Saudi arm imports from US between 2008 and 2018 was almost 14 billion, or about 60% of all arm imports are from the US. This is another table, shows the largest exporters of major arms and their main recipients between 2016 and 2020. And you see, again, Saudi Arabia for the US is the main importer of weapons, but the other country for Saudi Arabia is also the United Kingdom. This shows again, during the Trump administration, US-Saudi Arabia sealed weapons deal worth nearly 110 billion immediately and 350 billion over 10 years. So the US is the main supplier of weapons to the Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately, all these weapons have been used on the Yemeni people. This is another article from 2019. It says, defying Congress, Trump sets 8 billion plus in weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So if we look at the US support for the Saudi-led coalition war on Yemen, we see that they supply the majority of weapons. About 70% are from the US. They also conduct training for soldiers and pilots. They also conduct repair and maintenance of military arsenal, including aircraft. They provide targeting assistance and logistical support. The intelligence sharing was stopped by President Biden, and the naval blockade, we don't know how much they support that, but we know the weapons that are sold to the Saudi-led coalition are used to enforce the blockade. And then mid-air refueling, President Trump ended that in November of 2018 because it was included in the National Defense Authorization Act, requiring that we stop mid-air refueling for the Saudi war on Yemen. This is an article that was written by Bruce Riedel. Bruce Riedel is with the Brookings Institute and had worked for the CIA for over 20 years and also was stationed in Yemen at some point in time. He has written multiple articles. I encourage you to Google his name and see his articles on Yemen. He's saying it's time to stop US arms sales to Saudi Arabia. The blockade is, I think, for me as a public health practitioner, is the silent killer of the majority of people in Yemen. This is from the United Nations Verification Inspection Mechanism for 2021, and it shows the food and fuel imports to Yemen. Yemen requires over 500,000 of food to get into Yemen per month, and about 500,000 of fuel. And the blue lines here are the food that gets into Yemen. And we see here is 24% of what Yemen needs. In January, only 10% of what Yemen needed, and in February, and so forth. And it fluctuates. And we see that the majority of time, it's actually less than 25% of what Yemen needs in terms of bringing in food. In terms of fuel, it's even worse. You can see that Yemen gets very little fuel that's allowed into the country. For example, in August and July, there were almost zero, and September, fuel getting into the ports. And that, of course, impacts everything in the country. This is again from the UN inspection system. And it shows here that, for example, in 2016, there were 40,000 vessels that were allowed to enter into the Hodeidah port, which is the largest port in Yemen. And by 2021, we see only 1,600 vessels allowed into Hodeidah. That's a huge drop of vessels allowed into Yemen. This is Maha Naji. Maha is someone I know, and she works for an international aid agencies. And this is her experience. She wrote about how she feels about the siege and the blockade on Yemen. She said a siege was imposed on all the country and the airport was closed. The sky is the property of Saudi Arabia and other countries of the coalition. We are prisoners in our home. It's not allowed to move out before getting the approval of Saudi. And most probably your request will be rejected. After the siege, most of the company closed and thousands of employees became jobless. And I have to vouch for that because anytime I want to go to Yemen, I have to submit my name to the Saudi-led coalition to get approval to travel to Yemen. And that's why we don't see a lot of, journalists going to Yemen because they get denied entry into the country. So given the blockade and the airstrikes, how has that affected the humanitarian crisis in Yemen? This is from the UN. It says widespread conflict, severe economic decline, food insecurity, and collapse of essential services continue to take an enormous toll on the population, exacerbating existing vulnerabilities. So, and if we look at the number of people who've died in Yemen based on the statistics that are available, the UN says there are about 377,000 people who've died in Yemen by 2021. And unfortunately, this is a much underestimate number than the true number because we don't have a surveillance system in the country that actually would account all the deaths in the country. And it says also that 60% of these deaths have been caused by indirect impact, such as lack of safe water, hunger, and disease. And we also know that a lot of kids die of hunger in their homes, and we don't know about them. The article goes also to say the UN report goes to say that 70% of those who die are actually children. This is again from the UN, key figures, 20.7, this is in 2021, 20.7 million people in Yemen are in need of humanitarian assistance, 12 are in acute need, and there are 4 million who are displaced from their homes due to the airstrikes and the fighting. And because Yemen is under a blockade, people cannot leave and be refugees like in other conflicts. Also, this is in terms of food insecurity. We see that the majority of people in Yemen are phase 3, 4, and 5. And that means that people are in crisis, in emergency, and in catastrophe. And there are 16.2 million people in Yemen who are at that risk of famine. I think what's important here, and I like the statement again from the UN, it says, Emergency Relief Coordinator reiterates that Yemen is being starved, while the Security Council echoes call for action. So Yemen is not starving. Yemen is actually purposefully being starved by the blockade on the country. This is Liz Grande testimony. She was the former humanitarian coordinator. She gave a testimony to the Senate in April of 21. She said, basically, there are coercive measures directed at destroying the economy by the Saudi-led coalition. They control the number and timing of all ships entering Hodeidah port. They stop payment of salaries for public servants in area under Ansarullah or the Houthis. There is a restrictions of lines of credit, quotes of importations of basic goods, including fuel and cooking gas, and also import restriction on industrial material. Measures are the main driver of the humanitarian crisis, ruined economic and financial enterprises, and starved public and national institutions of necessary resources. This is UNAID Chief Mark Lowcock, and he also basically reiterates the same thing. Yemen is speeding towards the worst famine the world has seen in decades. 60 million people in Yemen are going hungry, and 5 million of those are just one step away from famine. 400,000 Yemeni children under the age of 5 are severely malnourished. Those children are in their last weeks and months. They're starving to death. This is again from Lowcock, and he says a massive famine is creeping into Yemen. We need to stop it devouring a generation. And one thing about famine and malnutrition, it is a long-term effect on cognitive development of children. This is in terms of the impact of the population in summary. There are 24 million people in Yemen who are in need now. Remember, it was in 2021, there were 21 million. In terms of those who are in acute need, we have 2 million more by 2021. Most of those who are displaced are women and children, and the majority have been displaced for more than a year. And there are 15 million people in Yemen. Half of them are children who don't have access to safe water, sanitation, or hygiene. I'll focus a bit on health because that's what I'm comfortable with the most, as that is my expertise. This map is from the UN, also showing that only 50% of Yemeni health facilities are functional. 35% are partially functional, and 15% are non-functional due to the fighting. If we look at the COVID situation in Yemen, I think what is the most important part of this is the case fatality rate of 19.5%. That is the highest fatality rate of anywhere in the world. In terms of the impact on children, we have 11.3 million children who need humanitarian help. 10 million children need basic health services. 2 million children are acutely malnourished. 8 million children lack access to clean water. And 8 million children need emergency education support. And 2 million are out of school. Mental health among school children is high. In one estimate, it says that 79% of Yemeni children suffer from PTSD, and 10,000 children have been killed or maimed in this conflict. And this is from the World Food Program. David Beasley, he said, one child dying every 75 seconds as Yemen on the brink of the biggest famine in history. If we look at the under 5 mortality in Yemen from 1960 to 2020, we see that Yemen was doing actually quite well in terms of decreasing under 5 mortality. However, starting in 2015, we see a flattening of the curve of the decrease. If we look at fatality rate or death among those who are aged 5 to 24 years, we see starting again in 2015 an increase, a huge increase in the number of deaths in Yemen. In terms of schools, this is the situation for most schools, and I know that because we do provide aid to schools and we go and visit schools similar to this: no roof, no seats, no desk. In terms of health as well, as I said, half of the hospitals are out of service and the population are vulnerable to endemic diseases, including cholera. Yemen experienced the highest cholera that is in recorded history. Polio, Yemen was free of polio, and now polio is back. Diphtheria, since the 1980s, Yemen didn't have diphtheria, and now we have a huge outbreak in the last 3 to 4 years. And dengue fever is all over Yemen now. There are, again, 20 million people who are in need, and that 3/4 of Yemeni children suffer from malnutrition, and hospitals and health centers lack all basic needs. This is, again, David Beasley. Again, he's the chief of the World Food Programs. He said Yemenis are starving for food, for fuel, for medical supplies, for hope. This is from CNN. Famine has arrived in pockets of Yemen. Saudi ships blocking fuel aren't helping. If we look at women's health, we know that there are at least over 1 million women, pregnant women, who are at risk of malnutrition, acute malnutrition. And this is again from David Beasley when he visited Yemen. He said, I've been in many maternity wards, and they are usually a place of joy. But in Yemen, I witnessed the devastation of malnutrition and hunger, with newborn babies on feeding tubes and mothers weakened by fear and exhaustion. Every 2 hours, a woman dies from complications of pregnancy. For pregnant women, severe malnutrition, giving birth is life-threatening. So in terms of the health facilities, again, the majority of the population in Yemen have limited access to health services. The high transportation costs, poor roads, infrastructure, insecurity, and road blocks and fighting make it very difficult for the population to be able to visit health services when they need it, and reduce availability and high cost of specialized care, with economic decline burdens patients who suffer chronic illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, diphtheria, and cancer. And a lot of medication for these diseases are not available in the market. And if they are available, they are out of reach for the majority of the population. I want to mention also Sana'a Airport, because when I travel, I cannot travel to Sana'a Airport because it is blocked. Nobody can fly into it except UN flights. And this is Jan Egeland, who is the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He visited Yemen in 2021, and he said, just landed in Yemen, empty baggage carousels and deserted arrival halls welcome us. Sadly, little has improved on arrival since I was here 3 years ago. Yemeni in the capital have been grounded since Sana'a Airport was shut in 2016. So the impact on Sana'a Airport closure, this is based on UN report, thousands of critically ill patients stranded with Sana'a Airport closure. They cannot go for medication anywhere outside Yemen. 5 years of restrictions imposed on Yemen's airport space by the Saudi-led coalition is preventing thousands of sick Yemeni civilians from seeking urgent medical treatment outside the country. And this is a statement by the Norwegians and CARE. The airport closure is also causing economic losses estimated to be in the billions over the last 5 years, worsening further an already dire humanitarian situation. It's like a hostage situation that has lasted for 5 years, said NRC Yemen acting director. The closure of the airport has also led to complete halt commercial cargo, such as medicine, medical supplies, and equipment coming into the country. So in summary, for the health part, increased morbidity and mortality in Yemen, damage to the infrastructure leading to increased risk of infectious diseases, outbreaks, weakened health system, shortages of medical supplies, including medication for chronic diseases, fuel shortages, reducing hours of operation or closing, especially in rural areas, and collapsed economy in Yemen due to the blockade on Yemen. So in all of this, now we have 8 cuts, unfortunately. This is again, David Beasley, and this is from February of this year, February 13. He said, it's a countdown to catastrophe in Yemen. When we are out of money, people don't eat. That's why 8 million receive half rations now. Without urgent funding, WFP will be forced to do the unthinkable and fully cut rations for millions. This is another one. UN suspends Yemen Relief projects over funding shortages. And a third one says 8 million Yemeni could lose aid next month as war rages. I'll talk very briefly about Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation. So and this is the organization I founded, we focus on health projects, income generation projects, water and education, and we also distribute food baskets. Like you saw, the WFP is going to be cutting aid to 8 million people in Yemen. We also support orphans. These are our numbers from 2021 in the categories that we support. We were fortunate to be able to reach over 226,000 people with food and 32,000 people with meat, and supporting 6,000 children with schools. And I will not go more onto that, but just that our work has been, we've been able to do some work that we're very happy with. I also want to talk about Yemeni people's resiliency. People in Yemen are very resilient, after 7 years of war and a blockade. And this is, Yemen is actually very mountainous, and people don't think that. They think of most of Arabia being desert. And the highest mountain in the Middle East are actually in Yemen. And people live on top of mountains with villages, and it's very hard to reach. And that's where most of our work is being done. These are healthcare workers taking vaccines. They can, drive up to a point, and once they reach a point, they have to use donkeys to help them take the vaccines. And this is actually, if you can see it, this is a propane, tank, and they use that for the cold chain for the vaccine, so it doesn't go bad. This is again just to show you the settlements, how they are normally at the very top of the mountains. And this is, again, these are the areas we as Yemen Relief work in, because we know these are areas that are hard for other organizations to go to. And you can see here the healthcare workers are walking to reach the places that they need to reach. I do have a call for action as American citizens, what we can do. This is House Democrats seek to halt remaining US support to Saudi air war in Yemen. This is Rawkana from California. He is calling for President Biden to sanction Mohammed bin Salman and calls for US and UK to halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And then we have Representative Jayapal from Seattle and Representative DeFazio calling for a war power resolution. And this is a publication they just had out in February 7 of this month, saying why we intend to pass a new war power resolution. Under the Trump administration, war power resolution was passed by both houses. However, unfortunately, President Trump vetoed the war power resolution, and that is to end US support for the war in Yemen. This is a toolkit from the Friends Committee on National Legislation for people who are interested on what they can do. And they also have a question and answer that I helped them with, because they sent it to me to review, which I reviewed and provided some comments. So I know many of you may have questions after this. This is an excellent source on the Saudi war on Yemen, and it asked about who the Houthis are, who is the internationally recognized government, what is the US role. So a lot of the questions that you may have is in this document. And I'm happy also to share my presentation with you guys so you can have this as a resource. And this is my email. Happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, we have a couple of chat questions. Why is Saudi Arabia fighting Yemen in the first place?
For me, to be honest, it's a very hard question. And the reason I have a hard question with it, because Saudi Arabia had itself reported several reasons why it's fighting in Yemen. So initially, when they decided to go into war, they said they are there because they want to reinstate the internationally recognized government that's been staying in a Saudi hotel for 7 years now. Another time, they said they are fighting the Iranians in Yemen. A third time, they say the Houthis are hostile to Saudi Arabia, and they want to make sure they don't have a hostile force that's bordering Saudi Arabia. So they themselves have changed the narrative on why they are at war in Yemen. I would actually tend to refer to a publication by the German intelligence service. The German intelligence service actually published a report in 2015 calling Mohammed bin Salman a destabilizing factor in the Middle East. And in it, they also alluded to the fact that Mohammed bin Salman, when he became the Minister of Defense at age 28, he wanted, and people didn't know who he was, he wanted to be a very popular, and a national hero and be second in line to be king. And that he thought by going to war into Yemen, this is an easy war, 2 months maximum. And that's what he actually said, that it would take 3 months maximum, 2 weeks to 3 months. That's what they told President Obama when he decided to support them on the war. And it failed. If he thought he was going to be there for 3 months, it's 7 years now and counting. So again, it's very hard to tell the real motive for it, but the Saudi themselves have changed the narratives. There are other people who say the location of Yemen is very important, that after the Arab Spring and the loss of, the previous president of Yemen who used to do what the Saudi asked them, the Saudi felt that they are losing control of Yemen. There are also people who say there are resources in Yemen that the Saudis are interested in, especially in bordering areas. So I think it probably is a number of reasons, not just one reason. But I think the most important one is Mohammed bin Salman being a young man, not knowing what wars means, hastily decided to enter into a war.
Well answered. Next question. How long can the country hold out?
I'm going to say only God knows. As I said, people are extremely resilient, but it's frightening the way it's going on right now in Yemen. And I hope that people, especially the US administration, decides to do something more positive and nudge the Saudis, because they do have a lot of control with the Saudi Arabia, and they can nudge them to stop the war. And at least for me, in the blockade, because the blockade is really the silent killer of many people.
I have a travel question. With the Sana'a airport being closed, how did you get to the capital in September of 21 from Seattle, and how long did it take you to get there?
So right now, there are only a certain number of flights on Yemen National Air that are allowed into Aden Airport that's under the control of the Saudis. And they normally are allowed to fly from Jordan or Egypt or Sudan, which all are countries that are in the Saudi-led coalition. And so I flew into Cairo, had spent the night in Cairo because there were no connecting flights, of course, and then took a flight from Cairo to Aden. And when I reached Aden, unfortunately, my US phone, said, "Welcome to Saudi Arabia," because all the communication services in the airport belong to the Saudi. And then I had to spend the night in Aden because I had another 14 to 16 hour drive to Sana'a, where my parents are. So that's another night in Aden. And then the next morning I left at 6 a.m. To reach Sana'a around 8 p.m. or 8:30 p.m. And that's on a private car, a 4-wheel drive. And you drive through some really very difficult roads to be able to get there. And if there is an accident, and you go through these mountains, and if there is an accident or a car that flips in that road, then tough luck. You'll have to stay until they clear it. They don't clear it fast. So it took me 4 days to be able to get there. There's also the concern because the Saudi and the Emiratis control the airport in Aden, and because I'm a very outspoken critic of what they're doing in Yemen on the war, there's always the risk that I may be detained because there are a lot of Yemeni who are critical of the war, and especially of the Saudi and Emirati that vanish at the airport. They get to the airport in Aden, nobody knows where they are anymore. So before I left, I registered with the State Department, telling them that I'm going to Yemen. And I also called Representative Adam Smith, who is my representative, and told him that I was going to Yemen. If anything happens, that he would need to talk to the Saudis and the Emiratis to make sure that, no harm, don't stop me or I vanish at the airport. So I had to take precautions to make sure that I'm safe at the airport. So, and coming back, it's another 4 days as well. It used to take me less than 24 hours from Seattle to be in my parents' home.
Well, thank you. That's interesting. Your travel experience is interesting. Next question. Does Yemen have any allies? How about Iran or other Gulf states?
So the war, when it started, and how the US got involved, is because of the Iran nuclear negotiation. So President Obama was negotiating a deal secretively with the Iranians, and the Saudis and the Gulf countries felt threatened by that. And so to appease them, unfortunately, he agreed to support their war in Yemen. There is a very strong narrative in the media that Iran is supporting Houthis. And I think that is true, but at the same time, they are not proxies to Iran. So if they are supporting them because they may be giving them the technology for drones and missiles that they can then make in Yemen. And the relationship between Iran and Ansarullah, the Houthis, have actually strengthened over the 7 years. It wasn't very, very strong to start with. I remember in 2009 when there was a lot of destruction in the Houthi areas because they had been at war with the Yemeni government, and Iran sent money, funds for reconstruction. The Houthis refused the money and sent it back. They didn't want any money from Iran. So Iran is an opportunist in this instance, where they saw Saudi getting into war, and I think nobody is happier than Iran with this war going on, because it's low cost for them. They may be, as I said, sharing technology, but they are, but the Saudis are not, they are losing credibility. They are, people are calling them more criminals, and they're also losing a lot of money in this war. So for Iran, this is a perfect environment. Then they are not investing anything, and in return, they have Saudi, in a war that they are not able to get out of.
Another great answer, and maybe this is the time to repeat that Yemen is the second highest percentage of arms on the hands of civilians in the planet. So we're talking independent, like Afghanistan types of people.
Exactly. Yeah. So Leslie and I were talking early on. If you look at the statistics of civilians' arms ownership, the US is number one with 11 pieces of arms per person, even newborns. And Yemen, that statistics is 7 arms per person, including newborns. And then the third country is so way down. And so Yemenis are fiercely independent. They've never been colonized as a whole country by any power. It's called, there are 2 names for Yemen. One is of the Turks, because a lot of Turks died in Yemen when they were trying to conquer Yemen. And also another name is the graveyard of invaders. And you are very accurate by saying it's very much like Afghanistan.
Okay, the next question, this is getting very interesting. What was the source of food before the Yemeni before this? The terrain does not appear to be conducive to farming.
They actually import 90% of the food from overseas. And there was a population explosion. Yemen, in the early 70s, the population was 6 million. We are now at 30 million. So imports of food is very major. And that's why we have this huge humanitarian crisis due to the blockade, because they're not able to bring in the food that they need. I do want to say here that Yemen, the best coffee in the world actually grows in Yemen. Yemen was the biggest exporter of coffee in the world. And Mocha, the word Mocha, is the name of the port where Yemenis used to export their coffee from. So in international coffee competitions, Yemeni coffee always gets over 98% in terms of scores, which is the highest of anyone else. And coffee, and there is now an effort to strengthen the coffee agriculture in Yemen.
The next question, is there a Shia Sunni basis for this conflict? In other words, religious?
No, and we're very fortunate, although sometimes there is a narrative that is a Shia Sunni conflict, but that is not true. Some other people call it a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. In Yemen, the majority of people are either Zaydi, which is a form of Shia, but it's very different than the Shia that's practiced in Iran, for example. And the other one is Shafi'i, that is also a Sunni group that's very different than what is practiced in Saudi Arabia. And the Shafi'i and the Zaydi in Yemen are closer to each other than they are. So the Shafi'i are closer to Zaydi than they are to the Sunni in Saudi Arabia. And the Zaydis are closer to the Shafi'i in Yemen than they are to the Shia in Iran.
I can
Go ahead, Andy.
explain the question. Look, basically, if you attack the refineries, you get everybody upset because it causes trouble all over the place. You'll get everybody upset, including even now Biden will get upset. So to me, that sounds like a counterproductive strategy. Maybe they should get these drones to hit a few cities if you're going to do anything. But anyway, that's the gist.
I don't know why they do what they do. The warring parties all commit war crimes. So I don't know how they think and what their logic is. But one thing I would say that when they do that, the Yemen war gets a lot of attention in the media, and people get to hear about it. And sometimes people who are at when they feel they are between a rock and a hard place, they may act irrationally. But again, I would say everybody in Yemen who is involved in the war in Yemen have committed war crimes.
Okay, that's our last chat question. So now, whoops, we got another one under the bill there, Sealy. What will it take to get rid of the blockade?
I think pressure on the U.S. government. We actually were very, very close. We were working with a lot of advocacy groups around the country. We have about 200 groups. When we got that war power resolution passed before Trump vetoed it, and we just need to message our representatives and our senators that this blockade, I mean, think of Middle Ages siege. That's what it is about. Sieges, the purpose of sieges is to starve the population, and that's what, in the hope that they will revolt against the group that's is fighting from the city. What's happening in Yemen is actually the opposite. Is people become more nationalistic, and they see that the outside world doesn't care about them, so they're more likely to take arms and go and fight with Ansarullah, the Houthis. So I would ask each one of you if you can call your representative and call your senator and say, why are we supporting a blockade on Yemen? I've always been more concerned with the blockade than with the war itself, because I know that's where the majority of people are dying.
And so we have a request for you to go back to the beautiful picture of the Capitol that you shared and describe the architecture that we can see and what's the basis for it.
In Yemen, people build their homes using locally available material. Okay, why did it move to this? And this is in Sana'a, that's what they use.
We lost the picture.
I know we lost the picture. So they use locally available material, but also they build the homes so that the weather, they take into consideration the weather. So they would put, for example, the bedrooms, because they want them to be warm at the end of the day. And as I said, Yemen has a lot of mountains. and temperature can go to -8 degrees centigrade in the winter. So they will put, for example, the bedroom to the west because they want it to be warm when they go in. They will put the main places where they're going to keep fruits or grain below, and they also put them towards the north because that's where the cold air comes from. So everything is built in a way to take advantage of the local environment. Yemen also has 7 UNESCO heritage sites. One of them is called the Manhattan of the desert, and that is a town that's built in Shibam, in Hadramaut, and it has the first ever skyscrapers. And they also have bridges between the different buildings. Yemen also built one of the first dam in history. It was called Dam of Marib. In the highlands where the stone is black, they will build their homes with black stones, and then they will have the white stones as decoration. So, and every area has its own way of building, but a lot of them like to have these windows that have stained glass on them. So in the evening or when there's during sunrise, when the sun comes through the stained glass, you'll see the colors inside the room. So there are a lot of styles of buildings in Yemen.
It was a wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion of Yemen. I learned quite a bit about the country, the good and the bad. But more important, I learned a lot about the history. So thank you for that. Let's unmute yourselves and give Aisha a warm round of applause. Thank you, Aisha.